Who are the Afro-Americans? Often people ask, who are the Afro-Americans? We have some people who say that the Afro-Americans are descendants of people mainly from African slaves. Other people say that the Afro-Americans are indigenous to America. Or there's other people who say the Afro-Americans are Hebrews. But who are the Afro-Americans? If you do the research, you'll find out that the Afro-American is a unique population. The Afro-American represents, in a sense, not only an African, but he also represents three roots. Yes, three roots. Afro-Americans are not just descendants of African slaves or indigenous black Native Americans. Afro-Americans are also descended from black Europeans, because Afro-Americans are descended from these groups because all of these people was here. In this video, we're going to talk about the history of Afro-Americans. You can find out more about this history in my book, History of Blacks in America from Prehistory to 1877. Although it is a Common Core State Standards history, the book in a sense provides valuable essays on black people in America, North America that is. This book will answer the question, who is the Afro-American? Afro-American origins, Black Native Americans. The greatest myth about the Black Native Americans is that they never existed. This myth has been perpetuated by numerous American films which record the Indian wars with the Apache and Lakota tribes. Whites have created a myth that there were no black Native Americans. They teach that the only black Indians were slaves of the Mongoloid Indians. This is false. There were many black Native American nations when Europeans arrived in America. In fact, blacks have been in America for 100,000 years. Archaeologists have reconstructed the faces of ancient Americans from Brazil and Mexico. These faces are based on the skeletal remains dating back to 12,000 BC. Researchers working on these ancient people note that they resemble Negroes or Africans instead of contemporary Native Americans. These ancient people are called Paleo-Americans. In the Smithsonian magazine, Dr. Chatters, who found Naia's skeleton, noted that the small number of early American specimens discovered so far have smaller and shorter faces and longer and narrower skulls than later Native Americans, more closely resembling the modern people of Africa, Australia, and the South Pacific. This has led to speculation that perhaps the first Americans and Native Americans came from different homelands, Chatters continues, or migrated from Asia at different stages in their evolution. Here is a picture of Naia. She is clearly Negroid. Black people were the first to build mounds in the Americas. These black Native Americans built mounds that resembled mounds that were built by black people in Africa. The mounds in the United States may have been built by Africans for defensive purposes, while they tried to coexist with local American Indian populations that lived nearby. This hypothesis is supported by the fact that the Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri mound sites are located on hilltops overlooking valleys and are clearly defensive works covering many acres with formidable walls of earth, sometimes reinforced by stone, all evidently chosen for their impregnability. In lowland areas where there were probably few inhabitants or unsettled land, the mounds are various geometrical enclosures, octagons, circles, squares, ellipses. These mounds were more likely built without military interventions. Here we can see two artifacts. One artifact is from the African mounds built by the Mandingo people, and another is an artifact that comes from an American mound. If you look at these mound artifacts, you can see that they resemble each other because they were built by black Native Americans. The defensive-style mounds found in the United States had lines of embankments, which averaged between 5 to 30 feet high, with enclosures hundreds of acres wide. Leading out from many of these enclosures, there often were parallel walls, many miles long, forming great avenues. Leo Weiner felt that these mounds resembled the African cities of Luanda in the Congo and the ancient city of Benin. W. Du Bois noted, the mounds of the mound builders were probably replicas of Negro forts in Africa. That this tendency to build forts and stockades proceeded from the Antilles, whence the Arawaks had come in the beginning of the 16th century, is proved by the presence of similar works in Cuba. These are found in the most abandoned and least explored parts of the island, and there can be little doubt that they were locations of fugitive Negro and Indian stockades, precisely such as those that were in use in Africa. Here we can see other mound artifacts. These artifacts clearly show Negro or African people. We also see a mound that was excavated back in the day. We see the various levels, and we see how the artifacts, bows, and other things were placed in these ancient black Native American mounds. The art from the American mound builders in Brazil indicate the presence of Malian military personnel. Richard Hull in Munyacaye, African Civilization Before the Baturi, noted that, and I quote, the Mali Marines wore white caps on their heads and a white tunic. On the side of the skull caps worn by the Mali Marines. E. Murphy, History of African Civilization, said the uniform of the Malian military consisted of sandals, loose-fitting cotton breeches reaching down to the knees, a sleeveless tunic, and a white headdress of either cotton or leather, decorated with one or more feathers. Here you see two different ancient peoples. You can see that they wear the breeches that were identified as the normal military gear for a Malian Marine. The only occupied mounds seen by Europeans were those built by the African slaves, the Arawak Indians, and people in Florida. Hernando de Soto, the only European to see occupied mounds, tells us much about their construction and use. Here you can see some Caribbeans. These are the Carib people, the people who the Europeans met when they first arrived in the New World. Here's another picture of some of the Caribbean people, the Carib. Here we have a Carib woman who is with an West African. De Soto and his men discussed the mounds they found among the Florida Indians. Here, as mentioned earlier, lived some African black people. De Soto noted that at Ucinta, Florida, the town was of 7 or 8 houses built of timber and covered with palm leaves. The chief's house stood near the beach, upon a very high mound made by a hand for defense. At the other end of the town was a temple. It is interesting to note that in Florida, one of the major ethnic groups living there was the Yamasee or Jamasi people, which were described as blacks. The mounds in the United States were usually found near rivers. In the Ohio Valley, 10,000 miles have been discovered. The north of the mound zone begins in western New York and extended along the southern shore of Lake Erie into what is now Michigan, Wisconsin, and northern states of Iowa and Nebraska. In the southern United States, the mounds lined the Gulf of Mexico from Florida to eastern Texas and extended up through the Carolinas and across to the state of Oklahoma. The Spanish called the Native Americans Indians because they were black like the South Indians. Here's a picture of the Caribs, the first people that Columbus and other Europeans met when they sailed in the Caribbean islands. As you will note, these people were black like African Negroes or sub-Saharan Africans. They have also found many black skeletons of these Indians in the Caribbean. Here we can see an article from Man, a monthly record of anthropological science. This article, published in 1939, made it clear that many Negroid or Negro slaves, Negroes, had inhabited the Virgin Islands in pre-Columbian times. That means that these black people were not slaves. These skeletal remains date to pre-Columbian times. So this shows that these black people were in the area, in the Caribbean, before the Europeans arrived. There were many black Native Americans. In North Carolina, there were many black Native Americans, including the Yuchi, the Creek, and the Yamasee. Carolina Indians were painted by many painters, including Philip George Frederick Van Reyck. Van Reyck, he did many beautiful paintings of these black Native Americans. Some of these black Native Americans belonged to other tribes between the Creek and the Yamasee. There were the Secotan, the Yamacraw. These Indians, in a sense, fought many times the various European powers. But the black Native Americans had many wars, first with the Spanish and later the British colonists. These black Native Americans lived on the Atlantic seaboard from New York all the way down into Florida. These black Native Americans fought bravely for their lands. Some were sold into slavery into the Caribbean, while others were made slaves or identified as Negro freemen in the South. But the black Native Americans, they did not accept with passivity whites taking away their land. The black Native Americans had many wars, first the Spanish and later the British. Black Native Americans have a history of fighting Europeans for independence. This is especially true in the Carolinas. Here you can see a map, and on this map we can see many of the black Native American and also Mongoloid Native American tribes. Many of these tribes, Mongoloid and black Native Americans, live side by side. Black Native Americans fought the British. The most important war, or one of the famous wars of these black Native Americans, was the Yamasee War. Here we can see the Yamasee fighting the British. The Yamasee had their shields and their clubs, and some of them even had guns. And they were facing the one of the dominant powers of Europe during that period, and that was the British. Over here we can see other Indians who had been fighting some of the British. These black Native Americans were made into slaves after they lost the war. Sadly, some of these black Native Americans were even sold into slavery in the Caribbean. As you can see from the Caribs, that there were already black people on many of the islands of the Caribbean, and so when they sold these black Native Americans from the Carolinas into slavery in Barbados, Jamaica, and etc., they were joining other black people who had already existed there for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. Many of these slaves worked on tobacco plantations. Most of the people that were forced to work on the plantations were women. The American planters felt that Indian women made good cultivators of tobacco, rice, and indigo. Here we can see some Indian slaves, a Mongoloid Indian and a black Native American being sold into slavery. They had created many laws to keep control over the black Native Americans and the Negroes. For example, here's a law from South Carolina written in 1722. Be it therefore enacted that all such Spanish, Negroes, Indians, Mustees, or mulattoes so imported into this province shall pay upon the public receiver for the use of this province a duty of 150 pounds current money of this province. So as you can see, there were many laws to contain and control the black people. Here's another law, and where the importation of Spanish, Indians, Mustees, Negroes, and mulattoes may be of dangerous consequence by enticing the slaves belonging to the inhabitants of the province to desert with them to the Spanish settlements near us. So as you can see, they didn't really like black Native Americans and African slaves to associate, because many African slaves would run away with the black Native American slaves, and they would join the Indians, and it was hard to get them, you see. So the Europeans tried to do everything they could to keep black people from Africa and black Native Americans from really joining or meeting one another. At first, the Europeans identified the black Native Americans as Indians. But over time, because the Carolina Indians were predominantly Negroes or blacks, both African and black Native American slaves were called Negroes, especially after the Yamasee War. Whites used bureaucratic erasure to take away the history and land of the black Native Americans. Black Native Americans who did not migrate to Indian Territory or sold into slavery were forced to declare on government records and census that they were free colored. This was bureaucratic erasure because black Native Americans were listed as free colored people, just like black Europeans and freed slaves instead of Indians or Native Americans. This had severe consequences. Because the Indians were identified as free colored folk, that was like saying that they had never existed as an independent people. That was saying that the black Native Americans never had their own nations. Today, many black Native Americans, most Native Americans carry RM-173. Here you can see a chart. As you can see, on this chart, that most Native Americans carry RM-173. You can find out more about these ancient black Native Americans in David Imhotep's book, The First Americans Were Africans. Documented evidence. In this book, David Imhotep provides considerable information about the black Native Americans. I also provide information on the black Native Americans in my book, African Empires in Ancient America. Other books that can provide you more information on these black Native Americans is The History of Blacks in America from Prehistory to 1877, written by myself, Dr. Clyde Winters, and especially We Are Not Just Africans, the Black Native Americans. In this book, I detail the history of blacks in the Americas, and I explain how black people went from dominating North America to becoming, in a sense, erased from history. Afro-American origins, the black Europeans. Afro-Americans have been taught a fake history. They have been taught that the ancestors of Afro-Americans were only slaves. This was a lie. The ancestors of Afro-Americans were also black Europeans and black Native Americans. Marcus Garvey said, "A people without the knowledge of their past, history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots." Afro-Americans need to know their authentic history and not a fake history. The fake history Afro-Americans have been taught to believe is a history that leads them to feel inferior, to feel as though they have always been servants and dependent on whites for civilization. This is false. The black man or Negro created civilization, and it was only since the Atlantic slave trade that the black man has been dependent on Europeans for their survival. They have lied about black history to make Afro-Americans believe their history totally lies in a faraway land, instead of knowing their roots were firmly laid in the United States due to the freedom their black Native American and black European ancestors enjoyed, until whites used racism, murder, and genocide to take away the heritage of Afro-Americans. The black European ancestors of Afro-Americans came to the United States from all over Europe. Most black Europeans came from Britain and Portugal, and some came from Germany. The first Europeans were blacks. They crossed the Straits of Gibraltar to settle Iberia 44,000 years ago. These blacks introduced the Aurignacian and Solutrean cultures to Iberia. Here is a picture of one of the first Europeans. As you can see, the first Europeans were dark-skinned and Negroid. Africans settled the Americas as early as 100,000 years ago in Brazil. By 20,000 years ago, blacks from Africa introduced the Solutrean culture to North America. Here's a picture of one of the earliest Afro-Americans. This Afro-American lived in Brazil, and archaeologists call this girl Luzia. The Romans report that when they arrived in Britain, many of the Celts were blacks. Here's a picture of the so-called Bengal lady, surrounded by her subjects. Here you can see that the Bengal lady was a very high and influential elite. Her tomb was full of very important objects, and we believe that she was a well-respected elite in her community. The European ancestors of the Afro-Americans were descendants of the black Celts and Moors that had lived in the British Isles for thousands of years. Other black European ancestors of Afro-Americans were Dutch and Portuguese. When the British began to colonize the United States, there were still many black Englishmen, like Oliver Cromwell. Here you can see a picture of Oliver Cromwell riding his horse. Oliver Cromwell was a black Englishman. He was appointed governor of Ireland. Oliver Cromwell was the son of a nobleman. He enjoyed a strict Puritan education at the College of the University of Cambridge and then studied law in London. In 1640, Cromwell was a member of Parliament and became the leader of the Puritan opposition to King Charles. Under Cromwell's leadership, he was able to put down over 100 rebellions staged by the Irish. He is a very strong leader in Ireland for the British. Black Muslims from West Africa ruled Iberia for over 700 years. Iberia is the peninsula where we find Spain and Portugal today. Blacks from Africa ruled Grenada since they had left Senegal and other parts of West and Northwest Africa. As a result, there were tens of thousands of blacks in Portugal after the Moors were forced out of Iberia in 1492. This is a painting of the Moors leaving Iberia in 1492 AD. As a result of blacks ruling Iberia for over 800 years, there were numerous blacks in Portugal and Spain. Here's a street scene in Lisbon, Portugal. Note the black Portuguese who were in many cases elites, while other black Portuguese were commoners. They also had many Dutchmen who came to the Americas. There are many black Dutchmen. For example, here we can see poet and playwright John Vos and the scientist Ethne van Leeuwenhoek. There were many famous Dutch black Europeans. As a result, many free blacks settled New Amsterdam, which later became New York City. Here we see other black Dutchmen. Many black Dutchmen came to the United States. In 1603, Matthew da Costa, a free black explorer, guided the French through parts of Canada and the Lake Champlain region of what is now New York State. Another famous black Dutchman was John Rodriguez. John Rodriguez was a free black sailor working for Dutch merchants. In 1612, he was left behind on Manhattan Island to establish trade with the local native population. Here you can see some of the black Europeans that lived in Amsterdam. There were also black Englishmen who came to the Americas. These black Englishmen even were in Jamestown before the first slaves came to the colony in 1619. Based on a census taken in March of 1619, There were already 32 blacks, 15 men, and 17 women in the service of Jamestown planters prior to the August arrival of the Dutch ship. Some of these blacks were freemen from Europe. In 1624, John Phillips, a Negro christened in England 12 years since, testified against a white man. Most of these blacks who were living in Jamestown were indentured servants. Indentured servants usually had to serve a number of years before they were given 50 acres of land of their own where they could become independent businessmen. Here we see colonial blacks. Note the black militiaman in the picture on the left, walking with some of the other Jamestown residents. We also sort of see a scene of some of the blacks who worked in some of the early colonial villages in New England. In summary, the Jamestown census and life of John Phillips proves that there were black Englishmen in the American colonies before the arrival of African slaves in the English colonies. It is a shame that for all these many years, people have been taught that the first blacks came to America in 1619 as slaves. As you can see, this is false. The most famous Afro-American of black European origin was Matthias de Souza. Matthias de Souza came to the United States as an indentured servant. De Souza came from Britain. He was the only black person to serve in the colonial Maryland legislature. Here we see a scene of some of the blacks and whites who worked in the various colonial cities in New England. As indentured servants, many Africans married European women. As a result, some Afro-Americans are the descendants of white women who married black indentured servants. In 1624, the first African-American child was born, free, in the English colonies. This Afro-American was William Tucker. He was baptized in Virginia. During the Revolutionary War, many blacks had to make a decision. Where some blacks remained in the Americas and sided with the colonists, most blacks, especially black Europeans and some black Native Americans, they fought on the British side of the American Revolution. As a result, many of these blacks who fought with the British left the United States and went to Canada. Sometimes people ask what happened to the free blacks. There were many blacks in colonial New England, and also blacks were in the South. But we find that the vast majority of blacks were in the colonial New England. That included Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. As you can see, in these areas, most of the blacks were not slaves, they were free people. Few blacks of direct European heritage probably live in the United States today. These descendants of free European blacks probably went to Canada after the Revolutionary War. Those Europeans who remained in the United States, especially those who lived in New England, probably married whites. Here we can see some of the slaves from New Orleans. And this would be pretty much the way some of the slaves would have been in the rest of the United States. Some were very dark, so you could see their clear African heritage, whereas others were very light-skinned and could pass for whites. We will never be able to account for the ancestry of the Afro-Americans who came from Europe, because over time most of them became whites. For example, in 1850, while 83 out of every 1,000 slaves was a mixed race, 581 out of every 1,000 free Afro-Americans, or 58%, were mulattoes. Given the evident high rate of intermarriage between blacks and whites in the North, free Afro-Americans of European descent could have easily numbered 20%. It is obvious that the vast majority of the Afro-American freemen in New England would have been black Europeans. Most of these blacks lived in New England and over time joined the white race. This is obvious if you look at the number of mulattoes that were free blacks. For example, in 1850, while 83 out of every 1,000 slaves was a mixed race, 581 out of every 1,000 free Afro-Americans, or 58%, were mulattoes. Given the evident high rate of intermarriage between blacks and whites in the North, it was only logical that as these blacks became lighter and lighter, they would join the white race to avoid the racism experienced by darker-skinned blacks. During the 1940s, they called this phenomenon of light-skinned blacks living as white Americans passing. The most obvious fallacy is that all United States blacks were slaves. Actually, about 16 to 20% of Afro-Americans were always free, and in that group, there were black slave owners. You can find out more about the black European ancestors of Afro-Americans in my book, History of Blacks in America from Prehistory to 1877. In this book, you will discover the history of the triad of blacks who form the Afro-American population today: Africans, black Europeans, black Native Americans. They all contributed to the rise of the Afro-American population. Buy my new book, History of Blacks in America from Prehistory 1877, and learn more about the actual origins of Afro-Americans.